We anticipate an 21 million Asians. You have been the majority minority for 400 years in this country. You have been the number 2 population for 400 years. You're going to get kicked out of being number 2. You're going to go down and become number 4. Now, common sense, even a 3rd grade education would tell you, if you didn't get anything when you were number 2, you all jumped ahead of me, but anyway, you can guess what you're going to get when you become number 4.
President Biden, do you support reparations?
Sure. I mean, since I haven't spoken on this, I've got a chance. Number one, the reason we're the country we are is because of immigration. We've been able to cherry pick the best from every single time. The people who come here have determination, resilience. They are ready to stand up and work like the devil. We have 24 out of every 100 children in our school today is Hispanic. The idea that we are going to walk away and not provide every opportunity for them is that not only stupid and immoral, but it's bad for America. They are the future of America. Such systemic racism that has plagued our nation for far, far too long. I said that over the course of the past year that the blinders have been taken off the nation, the American people. But what many Americans didn't see or had simply refused to see couldn't be ignored any longer. Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that took George Floyd's life opened the eyes of millions of Americans and millions of people around all over the world. It was the knee on the neck of justice, and it wouldn't be forgotten. It's not white Americans' fault, but just a fact.
The very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
We are owed $104 trillion on the very low end, plus $735 billion recurring. This number does not include the cost of about 50 Black Wall Streets that were decimated, nor compound interest from 2017 when Sean D. Rochester's book, The Black Tax, was published, nor the cost of Black life, nor the cost of living increases, nor the war on drugs, nor the current day pandemic. The number I'm working with is for slavery, Jim Crow, and accrued ongoing systemic racism, oppression, and disadvantage in the country our ancestors built with their lives. If you believe in this number as I do and would like to join me in the fight for reparations, please email me at friendsofadostv@gmail.com. That's friendsofadostv@gmail.com.
Good evening on the West Coast. Good evening in the mountain. Good evening in the central. Good evening on the East Coast. You know exactly who it is, family. Angela Nirvana, your hostess with the mostest on the reparationist perspective, bringing you those ADOCS hot topics and making the case for reparations, making the case for weaponizing our vote, socializing our suffering. And today, family, is my celebration and my education on the incomparable Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who everyone loves current day, right? Everyone loves Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., likes to quote him, likes to weaponize everything he did on behalf of ADOCS for their own individual fights for social and economic justice. But was he always liked, family? Was he always revered? Is the version of him that we see whitewashed? Are they just totally overlooking the radical aspect of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Was he for reparations? Is that why they executed him? Let's get into it. Thank you so much, Paxton Howard, and all of you for joining the live. Those who have yet to chat, I can't see everybody who is in the chat, but I thank you one and all for joining the live. I'm going to jump in because I only have an hour with you. So let's talk about it, family. Even though he is revered today, MLK Jr. was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. 75% of Americans disapproved of the civil rights leader as he spoke out against the Vietnam War and economic disparity. I'm going to be reading a few articles that I pulled together for tonight's show and commenting in between. Okay. According to an early 68 Harris poll, the man whose half-century of martyrdom we celebrate this week died with a public disapproval rating of nearly 75%. A figure shocking in its own day and still striking even in today's highly polarized political climate. While racial resentment was still a critical factor at that point, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s unfavorable numbers were at least 25 points higher in 68 than in 63. And his faltering appeal over the final years of his life was also a consequence of appearing to fall behind his times in some respects, even as he was leaping well ahead of them in others. A day after returning home in December 1964 from a tour, whose most important stop was Oslo, the Nobel laureate for peace joined a picket line at Atlanta's Scripto Pen factory, where some 700 workers were striking for better wages for less skilled employees. Though it was a remarkably humble gesture for someone who had received such a lofty affirmation, King's actions that day and his call for a nationwide boycott of Scripto products won him few friends in his hometown's white, staunchly anti-union business community. His picketing also foreshadowed a future in which King would move beyond the bloody battles against blatantly illegal state and local racial practices in places like Birmingham and Selma. Not content with the gains registered in the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, he resolved to pursue a more expansive, aggressive, and to white Americans especially, unsettling socioeconomic and political agenda. One that would draw him into another fateful labor dispute some 3.5 years later in Memphis. While still involved in the Scripto affair, King sat for a Playboy interview with Alex Haley in which he endorsed a massive federal aid program for Blacks. Keep this in mind, family, as we do a timeline to his execution. Its whopping $50 billion price tag was, he pointed out, less than annual U.S. spending for defense. Is this not our fight today? Is this not our fight today? We see a government pouring trillions of dollars into foreign aid, into the military, into the pandemic. Biden is like on what, day 72 or 3? Not one executive order For American descendants of chattel slavery, social nor economic justice nor inclusion. He weaponized George Floyd to give protections to Asians, and we've been waiting on an anti-lynch bill to turn into a law since forever. We are in our 400 plus year of our Holocaust with this country. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for money, $50 billion. Less than the annual U.S. spending for defense. Such an expenditure, he argued, would be more than justified in a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils. But poverty is profitable for capitalism in this country. At the expense of the American descendant of chattel slavery, you see. And aren't all of these ills still plaguing American descendants of chattel slavery to this very day? I'll read them again for kicks and giggles. School dropouts, family breakups, preschool to prison pipeline, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, other social ills, redlining into environmentally hazardous neighborhoods and tenement housing, unemployment, underemployment, dying disproportionately from the COVID. I'm throwing in some extras as they roll off the dome. No money to start our own businesses in our communities while you're giving set-asides and tax breaks to the immigrants to come into our communities and oppress us akin to how you oppress us. No money for homes. Affordable housing is a problem. I've shared with you in prior shows that Asians' median income in the nation is $87,000, to white folks $65,000, to American descendants of chattel slavery whose ancestors built the country with their lives, $41,000, with a median home price nationwide of $340,000. Back to the text. Many poor whites were in the very same boat with the Negro, he added, and if they could be persuaded to join forces with blacks, they could form a grand alliance and exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all. He was trying to do then what I'm trying to do now. Enlist immigrants. If Biden and Harris have their way, there'll be 92 million of y'all to our what? 40 million? Including, I think it's 46 million with black immigrants. Can you imagine what 92 million and 46 million could do to break the back of white supremacy? If you stop trying to identify as white to help the very people who are your reparations and why you're in this country, doing markedly more improved and greater, significantly greater than the very foundation of Black Americans that descend from chattel slavery. And this series is going to teach you about how we became the anchor of this country, to appeal to you to ally with us in our fight for social and economic justice. Back to the text. King had made passing allusions to this possibility before, but a straightforward call for an active biracial coalition of have-nots was just as terrifying to white ruling elites, be they on Peachtree Street or Wall Street, as it had been when raised by the populists in the 1890s. King did nothing to quell those concerns when he later told David Halberstam that he had abandoned the incremental approach to social change of his civil rights protest days in favor of pursuing a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values. Reminds me of Jamal Bowman, Justice Democrats, one which would look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation. See, I'm of the mindset that it's time for us to focus exclusively on ADOCS. We've tried this way. We've tried this way. It's not working. It's an epic fail. I'm suggesting that we weaponize the vote by voting a red top and a blue Congress to protect the over 53% of American descendant of chattel slavery who rely on government assistance by design of institutional systemic racism. And what I'm suggesting in weaponizing the vote is, number one, it's the only commodity we've got as a wealthless group. And number two, it's no different than what Dr. Charles Morris suggested after we delivered Teddy Roosevelt the vote, and he dishonorably discharged 167 Buffalo soldiers who were wrongfully accused of murdering a second white man after being quarantined in their barracks for being wrongfully accused of executing the first. Dr. Charles Morris, pastor of Abyssinian Church, said, "You shot us when our guns were empty, and we're going to return the same, with a blue top of the ticket and a red Congress to protect the Black South." This is when we were Republicans. So what I'm suggesting in the weaponization of the vote is we need you. Because what that does is it gridlocks government and slows it down so that we can replace the lames in office with full-chested reparationists. You don't get that white supremacy will never stop. Just like it's coming for the Asians, it's coming for all the groups. They'll give you access to whiteness only in as much as it benefits their oppression of us as the anchor of capitalism in this country. You got to understand that the only way to break the back of white supremacy is to stop anti-Black racism. It doesn't stop any other way. And that's what the Asians are now finding out. Back to the text. King's vision of a revolution in values was not purely domestic. In April '67, he denounced American involvement in Vietnam, once at his own Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And who's over there now? Raphael Warnock. Now heads up the very church that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. headed up. And Warnock ain't no Martin Luther King Jr. I hear that they got to sweep the homeless off the steps of Ebenezer Baptist Church before they allow the high-end boule parishioners to come entry. So that's the problem with a lot of our educated lanes. They get the education, they get the position, they get the favor, and they abandon the rest of us. I've shared with you on prior shows that of the 3 trillion household dollars that Blacks share, as compared to over 100 trillion that white folks share, including those that they make white. Hello, Asian. Hello, Hispanic. Hello, Jews. Hello, Italians. Hello, Irish. Hello, Indians. Hello, even some Blacks. Because there are 2 ways to get into whiteness. They make you white or you pay to get into your whiteness. Because the color of white in this country is green and skin tone. I lost that thought. Let me move on. I was trying to explain, basically that our educated lames are getting their butter biscuits and leaving whole groups behind. Thank you, God. My thoughts came back to me. The 3 trillion that our Black populace share, 10% of us share 2.3 trillion. And the other of us share 700 billion. Of the 3 trillion, 2.3 trillion, 10%, 90% of us share less than 700 billion. Okay? Less than 700 billion. Now, when you look at the makeup of Blacks in this country, 10% is Black immigrant. 90% of our American descendant of chattel slavery. So mostly Black immigrants, with some exceptions, sharing 2.3 trillion. The majority of the very descendants of chattel slavery sharing the less than 700 billion since COVID, with some exceptions. And yet black folks deliver Warnock, and we weren't even on his agenda. Back to the text. And once at Riverside Church, okay. So in April 1967, he denounced American involvement in Vietnam, once at his own Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and once at Riverside Church in New York before 3,000 people on April 4th, precisely a year before he was killed. Let me wave the banner, guys, if you feel so compelled to donate to the show. It helps me to offset the expenses of educating the masses and advocating for ADOCS. So the way to give is in the banner scrolling below. I keep forgetting to share that. So back to the text. He decided the hypocrisy of sending young black men 8,000 miles to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem. Beyond that lay the painful irony of seeing them join white soldiers with whom they could hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta in brutal solidarity as they torched the huts of a poor village. In this, they were, however, unwittingly, agents of a U.S. policy that destroyed and depopulated the countryside, forcing its former inhabitants to take refuge in cities teeming with hundreds of thousands of homeless children who were running in packs on the streets like animals. Former Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Chairman Stokely Carmichael observed that in this case, King was taking on not a hapless, wholly unsympathetic villain like Birmingham Sheriff Eugene Bull Connor, but rather the entire policy of the United States government. The consequences were swift and severe. An outraged President Lyndon Johnson cut off all contact with King. And a great number of Black Americans, including many old allies and colleagues from the civil rights years, warned that his stance could have devastating consequences for their cause. But sometimes you've got to lean in, family, and dig into your beliefs, dig your heels into what you believe. King hardly fared better in pursuing his domestic agenda. It was one thing to capture public sympathy nationwide when pitted against the raw hatred and brutality that seemed the peculiar province of whites below the Mason-Dixon line. It proved quite another to persuade whites outside the South to share their neighborhoods and jobs with blacks, or to support expensive federal assistance programs dedicated to helping blacks overcome the historic disadvantages imposed on them by whites of earlier generations. King had a better grasp of what he was up against after his 1966 open housing campaign in and around Chicago, where he confronted white mobs he described as more hateful than any he had seen even in Mississippi or Alabama. And look at what they term Chirac now. Rip Laquan McDonald. In this context, his own stern insistence on strict adherence to the doctrine of nonviolence met with growing disdain among a younger generation of Black leaders. Tired of relying on the excruciatingly slow process of peaceful protest and tedious negotiations, some mocked King's ministerial oratory and called him the Lord. It was impatience with King's doctrine of nonviolence that turned what would prove to be his last march on behalf of striking sanitation workers in Memphis on March 28, 1968, into a riot. Some marchers quickly broke ranks to break store windows, and looting was soon underway. An aggressive police response, complete with tear gas and billy clubs, led some protesters to retaliate with Molotov cocktails. By the end of the confrontation, one person was dead and some 50 others wounded. Feeling repudiated and ashamed by this failure to prevent violence, King had to be pressured into returning to Memphis a week later for yet another march. One that a single assassin's bullet on April 4th assured he would never lead. When Stokely Carmichael originally scheduled a press conference for April 5th, 1968, he had planned to use it as a platform for demanding the release of fellow Black militant H. Rap Brown, who had been stuck in Maryland jail for several weeks. Instead, he devoted but a few sentences to the plight of Brother Rap before declaring that white America made its biggest mistake last night by killing Dr. Martin Luther King. King's slaying meant the death of all reasonable hope, Carmichael warned, because he was the only man of our race, of the older generation, who the militants and the revolutionaries and the masses of Black people would still listen to, even if they no longer agree with what he had to say. There would be no more intellectual discussions. Black Americans would now retaliate for the murder of one of their leaders by seeking their justice, not in the courtrooms, but in the streets. And so they did in classically pirate fashion. Younger, more militant Black spokesmen who had spurned King's commitment to nonviolence and peaceful negotiation proceeded to stoke outrage over the slaughter of someone so unmenacing and well-intentioned. A week-long orgy of violence raged across more than 100 cities, leaving at least 37 people dead and many more injured, and millions of dollars in property destroyed. This was a bitterly ironic send-off for someone who had sacrificed his life to the cause of achieving social justice by peaceful means. King's views of the Vietnam War would approach the mainstream of American thought, within a few years. And his condemnations of American militarism and gross disparities in wealth and opportunity still echo, though to little more effect than he was able to achieve 50 years ago. Yet, the basis for today's approval rating, north of 90%, can be captured succinctly and carefully cropped newsreel footage of King's countless confrontations with vicious, inflammatory bigots and his magnificent oratory that day in August 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial, when achieving his dream seemed largely a matter of rallying his countrymen against institutionalized racial persecution in the South. Me speaking. You see, you don't care about Black Lives Matter until you care about our social and economic justice. Because dollars bring dignity, and being poor makes American descendants of chattel slavery a target for institutionalized systemic racism. Overly narrow historical memories typically serve a purpose. And in this case, it is far more comforting to focus on Dr. King's success and making a bad part of the country better than to contemplate his equally telling failures to push the whole of America to become what he knew it should be. Welcome to the live, one and all. And so, he was murdered April 4th, 1968. And in the months leading up to his assassination, his greatest focus was on poverty and economic injustice. So do you see why I believe he was executed? Because he was fighting for us, ADOCS, and other poor people. But his mission was reparations. The last march of Martin Luther King Jr. In the months leading up to his assassination 52 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made some of his most searing pronouncements against white supremacy, the Vietnam War, and U.S. imperialism. But more than at any other time in his life, King's final focus was on poverty and economic injustice. By the winter of '68, Dr. King and his organization were embarking on one of their boldest projects yet, a poor people's campaign that would bring a multiracial coalition to the nation's capital to demand federal funding for full employment, a guaranteed annual income, anti-poverty programs, and housing for the poor. Me speaking, we're still fighting for those things to this day. The 52nd anniversary of his murder. We are the anchor of America's capitalism, still fighting for social and economic justice and inclusion. Announcing their new initiative, King said the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, for those of you who don't know, will lead waves of the nation's poor and disinherited to Washington, D.C. next spring to demand redress of their grievances by the United States government and to secure at least jobs or income for all. The ideal for the Poor People's Campaign had been sparked by Senator Robert Kennedy in a simple message passed by Marion Wright, later Marion Wright Edelman, to King months earlier. At the close of a conversation between Kennedy and Wright, the senator had said, "Tell Dr. King to bring the people to Washington." If Kennedy's comment provided a final catalyst, the seeds of the Poor People's Campaign can be found a year earlier in the Mississippi Delta. In June 1966, King and his closest associate, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, were visiting a Head Start daycare in Marks, Mississippi, a tiny town in Quitman County, the poorest county in the country. It took them a moment to notice that the bright-eyed children were malnourished. ADOCS. At lunchtime, the teacher brought out a brown paper bag of apples and a box of crackers. When she cut an apple into quarters and gave one slice and 4 or 5 crackers to each of the waiting hungry students, King and Abernathy exchanged solemn glances. This was all the children had for lunch, they realized with shock. Neither man had ever seen poverty like this. Dr. King began weeping and had to leave the classroom. That night, lying on a motel bed and staring at the ceiling, King said, "Ralph, I can't get those children out of my mind." Viewers, I can't get George Floyd's execution out of my mind. I can't get Breonna Taylor's murder out of my mind. Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, Elijah McClain, Tamir Rice, I can't get it out of my mind. And this is why I'm using my voice and my platform to educate the masses and to advocate for American descendants of chattel slavery's social and economic justice and inclusion. Won't you join me as an ally? For the next year, King weathered setbacks in Chicago, challenges to his leadership from the emerging advocates of the Black Power movement, questions about the relevance of nonviolence in the face of increasing urban rebellions, and a storm of controversy over his stand against the war in Vietnam. But the issue of poverty never left his mind. The issue of our reparations never leaves my mind. The issues of our preschool to prison pipeline never leaves my mind. The issues of us being, of the homeless families in this country, over 50% our ADOCS never leaves my mind. The miseducation of ADOCS in America with 3K's book club series never leaves my mind. The being redlined into environmentally racist neighborhoods and tenement housing never leaves my mind. Unemployment, underemployment, the highest of any group in this country, never leaves my mind. The lack of business and home ownership amongst the very descendants of chattel slavery in this country never leaves my mind. The fact that we're dying disproportionately from COVID never leaves my mind. The fact that we've got little to no health care, medical apartheid, the stealing, the theft of our intellectual property never leaves my mind. At the SCLC staff retreat in November, King revealed his plans for a Poor People's March to Washington to his colleagues and called for a new stage of massive, active, nonviolent resistance to the evils of modern corporate society. This is why they executed him, family. 16 months after he had been moved to tears and marks, King was on the cusp of bringing 3,000 poor people, a nonviolent army, a freedom church of the poor, he called it, to Washington, D.C. to demand a radical redistribution of economic power. This is why he was murdered. King had long lived under a shadow of danger. His colleague Walter Fauntleroy remembered that when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, King gazed out a window and said, "Walter, you know, if they'll kill a president, I won't live to be 40. As author David Garrow states, in the last 12 months of his life, King represented a far greater political threat to the reigning American government than he ever had before. As King began to question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? He knew he was tampering and getting on dangerous ground. You see, it was okay for him to fight for access to water fountains and a seat at the counter and to share the same toilets and integrate education. It's okay to fight for integration, but you lose your life messing with America with 3K's bag. Because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with the economic system of our nation. But he did not back away from economic injustice. You see, when God moves on you, that this is the way you are to be used, you have to do it even afraid. There's no time amongst American descendants of chattel slavery to give in to fear from demanding the reparations and the trillions over multi-generations. Because it never leaves your mind. And so you allow yourself to be used. On March 4th, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sent an internal memo stressing the urgency of the counterintelligence program. That's what we get, COINTELPRO. While KKK neo-Nazis and skinheads can execute us with impunity. We get COINTELPRO when we fight against social and economic injustice. The FBI had initiated in August '67 against what they call Black nationalist hate groups. You see? To this day. To this day. Let me look up that article real quick. The FBI targets a new generation of Black activists. June 26, 2020. Throughout its history, the FBI has viewed Black activism as a potential national security threat, but we can't get an anti-lynch bill passed into law. Chauvin can need the life out of George Floyd as he cries for his mother while he urinates himself in front of cameras rolling, because the government refuses to give us an anti-lynch law, which makes it legal to execute us with impunity. We can't be active when it comes to our social and economic injustice, because to this day, our activism is seen as a potential national security threat. No anti-lynch bill law for us. And the KKK has not been deemed a national security threat. The skinheads have not been deemed a national security threat. The KKK and the neo-Nazis have not been deemed a national security threat. It has used its ample investigative powers not to suppress violence, but to inhibit the speech and association rights of Black activists. Look at all the Black Lives Matter activists turning up dead. They just found a young, beautiful girl in the river. And where is the Black Lives Matter Federation that acquired $90 million in 2020 alone, weaponizing George Floyd's execution by the race soldier to raise $90 million? Where's the money to help these families get private investigators? Because the police, investigating the police don't ever turn out well for ADOCS. Where's that money? Black Lives Matter was formed around Trayvon Martin. How many of those families whom they've weaponized for the come up financially have they poured back into those families, into those communities? How much money have they poured into these chapter leaders who are in the grassroots that have been executed while folks are saying, oh, he committed suicide. He dropped his pants and then hung himself from a tree. He blew up his car. She threw herself into the river. Where's the money to help those families? Well, we are deemed for fighting for our people as national security threats. And its reaction to the protests following the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd shows little has changed. They got, I want to say, 300 National Guards and police soldiers, race soldiers, surrounding the courthouse of the Chauvin trial. Where were those people during the insurrection? Oh, they were working together to give them access to Nancy Pelosi's desk for them to put their feet on, for them to carry away bust, for them to smear feces and piss all throughout, oh my God, throughout the Capitol. How much time are they serving? Have they been convicted of an insurrection? But you got 300 National Guards and race soldiers surrounding the courthouse. As the judge sits up here and helps defense, I shared on my anti-racism channel covering the Chauvin trial that there were 8 similar incidents before the blood choke of George Floyd by Chauvin. The prosecution I'm sorry, the judge is only allowing 2 of the weakest of those 8. 18 complaints in 19 years, 8 of which paralleled, mirrored what he did to George Floyd, and Cahill will only allow the weakest 2, while letting defense use a March 2019 incident when Floyd ingested drugs so he wouldn't be arrested by the officers, to show the parallel between his hysteria over being executed by the race soldiers for having drugs in his possession, akin to his hysteria over being executed that was finally fulfilled. Defense is trying to make an association between his drug use and his paranoia of a police force that ultimately executed him in cold blood for all the world to watch on everybody's camera phone. Cahill is helping defense. In October 1919, a young J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Bureau of Investigation's General Intelligence Division, targeted Black Moses Marcus Garvey for investigation and harassment because of his alleged association with radical elements that were agitating the Negro movement. Hoover admitted Garvey had violated no federal laws, but the Bureau, the precursor organization to the FBI, infiltrated Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association with informant provocateurs and undercover agents who searched for years for any charge that could justify his deportation. The Justice Department ultimately won a conviction against Garvey on a dubious mail fraud charge in 1923. Meanwhile, white vigilantes, police, and soldiers targeted Black communities with violence during this period, which included the Red Summer of 1919, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, and scores of lynchings. Did not receive the same focused attention from Hoover's agents. The FBI used similar tactics to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize leaders of the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s. The FBI's COINTEL program targeting civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael was specifically designed to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement, rather than to prevent any violent acts they might perpetrate. The methods included informant-driven disinformation campaigns designed to spark conflict with the movement, discourage donors and supporters, and even break up marriages. Overt investigative activity was also used, as one stated goal of the COINTEL program was to inspire fear among activists by convincing them that an FBI agent lurked behind every mailbox. Exposure to COINTELPRO abuses led to an era of reform starting in '76, including guidelines issued by the Attorney General Edward Levy to limit FBI investigations of political activity by requiring a reasonable indication of criminal activity before intrusive investigations could be launched. Unfortunately, the guidelines were weakened over time, most severely in December 2008 by the Bush administration Attorney General Michael Mukasey. Mukasey's guidelines authorized a new type of investigation called an assessment, which required no factual basis for suspecting individualized wrongdoing before agents could employ intrusive investigative techniques such as overt and covert interviews, physical surveillance, government and commercial database searches, and recruiting and tasking informants. The FBI interpreted these guidelines to allow its agents to use census data to map American communities by race and ethnicity, and to identify and monitor ethnic facilities and behaviors. A 2009 memo from the Atlanta FBI cited fears of a Black separatist terrorism threat to justify opening an assessment that documented the growth of the Black population in Georgia. So it wasn't surprising that when a new generation of political activists started the Black Lives Matter movement to protest police violence after the fatal 2014 shooting of unarmed teenager Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the FBI began tracking them all across the country, using its assessment authority to conduct months-long investigations. BLM activists reported the FBI agents had contacted them at home to warn them against attending the 2016 Republican National Convention. By 2017, the FBI had invented a new domestic terrorism program category it called the Black Identity Extremism Movement, excuse me. 2017, and we still don't have KKK, neo-Nazis, and skinheads labeled as the domestic terrorists they are. An FBI intelligence report cited 6 unrelated incidents over a 3-year period in which Black subjects not associated with one another attacked police officers to allege that a terrorist movement driven by perceptions of police brutality against African Americans existed. The report stated that the perceived, unchallenged, illegitimate actions of law enforcement will inspire premeditated attacks against law enforcement by so-called Black identity extremists, suggesting that the FBI's concerns lay not in illegal police violence, but the hypothetical retaliation it might provoke. In 2018 and 2019, the FBI conducted nationwide assessments of Black identity extremists under an intelligence collection operation it called Iron Fist, prioritizing these cases over investigations of far more prevalent violence from white supremacists and far-right militants over that period, including mass shootings at a Pittsburgh synagogue and an El Paso shopping mall. This is how we got here, family. The FBI also acknowledged using its most advanced surveillance aircraft to monitor BLM protests in Baltimore after the police killing of Freddie Gray in 2018, and again this month at the BLM protest in Washington, D.C. And that's why I'm saying the deaths of these chapter leaders in the grassroots needs to be investigated. And as the Intercept reported last week, at least 4 organizers of the Black Lives Matter rally in Cookeville, Tennessee, received unscheduled visits at their homes and workplaces by FBI agents assigned to the local Joint Terrorism Task Force. The agents questioned them about their social media posts, their plans for the protests, and whether they had connections to Antifa, anti-fascist activists who Donald Trump has blamed for inciting violence at BLM protests. Those same protests where Kyle Rittenhour was allowed as a civilian to execute 2 Black Lives Matter protesters and seriously injure a third, while the police gave him water. The FBI has reported it found no evidence of Antifa involvement at the protests. Currently, there is a potential for violence at any protest, and the FBI has made more than 80 federal arrests of looters and arsonists in recent weeks. But so far, the most apparent protest violence that falls within the FBI's jurisdiction is not coming from BLM activists or Antifa, but from police. And like I said on my anti-racism show, anti-Black racism show, the FBI did its investigations of the police force throughout the country in 2016 and found that at least since 2006, it had been infiltrated by KKK, neo-Nazis, and skinheads who are allowed to get gainful employment even though they're associated with these groups because they've got the unmitigated gall to say to not allow them access to these hate groups is to violate their First Amendment rights. So you see why you don't care about Black life until you care about our social and economic inclusion and justice, because dollars bring dignity, and being poor makes us a target. While Biden gives the Asians protections. This is what we're continuously enduring, our over 400-year Holocaust. From the time they came over to Africa to capture us, to purchase us, to steal us. North Carolina lawyer T. Greg Doucette and mathematician Jason Miller have compiled a data set of more than 500 incidents of police violence against protesters that have been captured on video by activists and journalists since George Floyd's death. Several of the officers responsible for this violence have been fired, and a handful have been charged with state violations, but no federal civil rights charges appear to have been brought yet against law enforcers who have been caught on tape attacking peaceful protesters and reporters. They even attacked one of their own. Let's talk about it. No convictions for St. Louis officers who beat Black undercover colleague at the protest. Officer Luther Hall, who was recording criminal activity during protests, required multiple surgeries after the attack. No convictions were returned for 3 white St. Louis police officers accused of beating a Black undercover colleague so severely during a protest over another officer's acquittal that he had to undergo multiple surgeries. We're going to get back to Martin, but this is just so rich. It's a perfect time to kind of introduce, as the ADOCS world turns, hot topics segment, tie this into what we're doing. It'll go over an hour because I need to get this up and out in this video. So get your libations, get comfortable. I'm moving with the spirit right now. A jury on Monday acquitted Officer Stephen Corte of charges of deprivation of rights under color of law and of lying to the FBI in connection to the attack on Officer Luther Hall. It happened when Hall was mistaken for a protester during demonstrations that erupted after former police officer Jason Stockley, who is white, was found not guilty in the 2011 death of Anthony Lamar Smith, who was Black. Hall described the 2017 attack to jurors as a free-for-all. The former officer, Christopher Myers, also was acquitted of a deprivation of rights count, but the jury could not reach a verdict on a charge of destruction of evidence against Myers for allegedly smashing Hall's cell phone. The jury also deadlocked on the deprivation of rights charge against the former officer Dustin Boone, leading the judge to declare a mistrial on counts where the jury could not agree. Defense lawyers said police department dysfunction meant officers and supervisors on the street didn't know undercover officers were working that night. Defense lawyers also challenged Hall's ability to identify his attackers. The verdicts reignited criticism that an all-white jury was picked to decide the case. If an undercover cop can't get justice, how will the rest of us who have been maced, shot, beaten, and brutalized ever get justice? Tweeted Cori Bush, a Black congresswoman who represents the Missouri district that includes St. Louis. 2 other officers, Randy Hayes and Bailey Coletta, both of whom are white, entered pleas in the case. Hayes pleaded guilty in 2018 to 1 felony count of deprivation of rights under color of law and admitted hitting Hall with a baton and shoving him to the ground. Coletta pleaded guilty to making false statements to the grand jury about the assault. The St. Louis region was still recovering from unrest that followed the fatal 2014 police shooting of Michael Brown in nearby Ferguson. 2 nights after Stockley's acquittal, demonstrators broke windows downtown. Police made 123 arrests, but protesters and civil rights leaders said many of those arrested were peaceful demonstrators, journalists, and onlookers who were brutalized and taunted. Hall, who had been recording criminal activity during the protest, became separated from his partner while fleeing officers who were firing pepper spray pellets and beanbag rounds into the crowd. The assisting U.S. attorney, Kerry Constantine, told the jurors that as Hall was complying with orders to get on the ground, he was knocked down, hit, picked up, and knocked down again before being attacked with fists, feet, and a baton. Hall said he did not push, fight, or pull away from the officers. He said he was stunned. I couldn't believe it was happening, he told the jury. Prosecutors have said 2 of the officers, Myers and Boone, were motivated by an eagerness to harm protesters, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported. Hall didn't tell officers he was undercover because he did not want to ruin his chances of working undercover at future protests. A sergeant later recognized Hall and had him pulled aside. Hall suffered a hole in his lip that had to be stitched closed, injuries to his jaw, and injuries to his neck that would later require spinal fusion. He also was unable to eat solid foods for weeks, causing him to lose 20 pounds. Hall sued the department and officers, including Myers and Boone, but recently settled the case against the department for $5 million. He remains with the department. Corte also is still with the department, but the others have all left. So, I want to jump now to more on King. Let's talk about the assassination. Well, we're not going to do that one. In the namesake of time, I want to jump to something else. We may go back to that one. Just give me a second. Forget the notion of MLK as a dreamer, say activists. He was a radical whose rhetoric is used today. America, with 3 Ks, has been comfortable with Dr. King the dreamer as opposed to Dr. King who articulates the American nightmare, said the Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, pastor of the historic Mother Bethel AME Church. The legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is often celebrated by conjuring his words spoken at the 63 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. His I Have a Dream speech has come to be remembered as inspired, rousing, and optimistic about race relations in America. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood, he said on that August day in Washington. Increasingly, though, Black Americans are calling for new ways to analyze and celebrate his legacy more accurately. America has been comfortable with Dr. King the dreamer as opposed to Dr. King who articulates the American nightmare. The man who was assassinated in Memphis on April 4, 1968 at age 39. So, his premonition came true. They murdered him before his 40th birthday. Remember, I cited earlier that he mentioned if they could kill a president, I'm not going to live until 40. Denounced racism, materialism, and militarism. He predicted social ills would never be solved without fixing entrenched inequity. And he called out U.S. economic policy. Oh, akin to what I'm doing here. I stand on the shoulders of. In fact, many activists who are asking today for reparations to repair the damage Black Americans have suffered, subject that last year rose to the levels of presidential candidate debates, borrow rhetoric from King's combative spirit. Federal government. In the next campaign on Washington, King said, "We're coming to get our check." And we're going to hear a bit of that at the end, about 4 minutes of his tape on reparations. It's powerful. I'm going to close the segment out with that. By 67, King came to confess in an interview with NBC News correspondent Sandra Banacker, "That dream I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare." Yet, said Solomon Jones, a host for Philadelphia radio station WURD and a columnist for The Inquirer, America has come to sanitize King's ideas to prevent them from growing into a larger movement. "I have a dream allows for the status quo to remain," Jones said. It doesn't allow his dream to say we want equal opportunity in jobs, in housing, and in every aspect of society that King spoke out for. The irony, though, said Anthony Monteiro, a former Temple University professor and panelist at the 3rd annual Radical MLK Symposium, sponsored by Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books on Friday, is that King had always been radical, long before his speech at the March on Washington. King once said that the bombs that were dropped in Vietnam exploded in Watts, Detroit, and Philadelphia, he added. He meant that spending on war took away from the money needed in the United States to address poverty. Philadelphia lawyer and activist Michael Cord, co-founder of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, said, "Anyone who reduces him to the 63 I Have a Dream speech knows very little about him." King, Cord said, was critical of capitalism and called for a better redistribution of wealth. In that 67 interview, King said there must be a revolution of values in our country, and as Jimmy Baldwin said, what advantage is there to be integrated into a burning house? Demanding reparations, said Chad Brown, a member of the LA ADOCS movement, reflects a sentiment that shows up in several of King's speeches, including when he talked about how the U.S. government gave millions of acres of land to immigrants from Europe, but gave nothing to the Black Americans who came here in chains. Well, they did. Abraham Lincoln gave us 40 acres and a mule, and Andrew Johnson took it away and gave the Homestead Act for 93 years to immigrants and our white slave owners alike. Slavery wasn't just in the South. It was in the North too. In the West and the East. We're going to get into that during this series. Hi, Jewel. I'm live over in YouTube if you want to join me. I'm almost done. Thank you for joining in Clubhouse. Okay. In several speeches between 67 and 68, including his 3 Evils of Society speech, King talked about how land grant colleges were built to help white immigrant farmers improve their soil, how low-interest loans were given, and how eventually, after the farmers became successful, millions in federal subsidies were paid to farmers to not grow crops. We cry out against welfare or handout to the poor, but generously approve an oil depletion allowance to make the rich richer, King said. 6 Mississippi plantations receive more than $1 million a year not to plant cotton, but no provision is made to feed the tenant farmer who was put out of work by the government subsidy. To this day, our Black farmers are fighting to be paid. Tyler of Mother Bethel said, the dream is wonderful because the dream is general. It's vague. It's a wonderful thing to talk about equality and fairness and justice. But to attain true equality and justice, he said, King put his finger on the pulse of a number of things needed to eradicate poverty. King himself said that integrating lunch counters in public parks was easy because it didn't cost anything. But true equality would require spending money. We are confronting issues that can't be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars, King said. We can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something. So let me stop right there, see what you guys have to say before I close us out with prayer and with the video on reparations. Paxton Howard, welcome to the live. Let's see here. Who else? Trey Lincoln is back. I love you, Black and Strong fam. Thank you for joining the live yet again. Lafayette Ward, Robert S. Jr. Dickerson. How to donate? It's in the little byline. To donate to the show, $FOADOS TV. Cash App. $FOADOS TV. Thank you so much, Rodney Young, for joining the live, my love. George Jackson, yes, dollars bring dignity, and being poor makes us George Floyd. Thank you for joining the live. Teresa Moses is still rolling strong. I love that Dayton, Ohio ADOCS. Yes, the C is for channel. Puts up a more secure gate around our reparations demands. George Jackson, I see you, family. Jennifer Meadows, Edek, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for that. Peace, Josh Gray L from Be the Power. You guys have got to check out the Rich Be the Power in the new Black media. Thank you, Lafayette Ward. He typed in $FOADOS TV. Okay, family. With that said, let me tell you how to reach me if you want to get in this fight. I haven't created my new Gmail yet, so you'll have to Gmail me at friendsofadostv@gmail. I'm typing that in here. Okay, family. I thank you so much. Let me share the video now. It's just 4 minutes, and then I'll pray us out. Thank you, one and all, and even those who have yet to type who you are. I thank you for joining the live. I thank you for caring in this way to get informed and to consider becoming an ally in our fight for social and economic justice. I really appreciate you, fam. I really do, more than words can convey. So let me share the screen, and then we can pray out. I got to share it with audio. That's the video that you see flashing, but as a still shot. But if I don't share the audio, you won't hear it. So I had to go back out and go back in. You know, one of these days I'm going to be fancy enough to have a producer and not have to wear all the hats, family. ADOCS life. But God has inspired me to do this work and all these rich new series that are, you know, being manifested. That's nothing but the God in me sharing what I need to do to help push us towards the reparations we are long overdue. Okay, so sharing the screen again. Let's hear from the incredible Martin Luther King Jr.
So we suffer from a kind of poverty of the spirit, which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The problem is, my friends, that we have learned to fly the air like birds, and we have learned to swim the seas like fish, and yet we haven't learned to walk the earth like brothers and sisters. Racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame. So wherever we live in America, we have to face the fact honestly that racial discrimination is present. So don't get complacent. Certainly we've made some strides. We made some progress here and there. It hadn't been enough. It hadn't been fast enough. And although we've come a long, long way, we still have a long, long way to go. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln. But the Negro was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. And you know, it was something like having a man in jail for years and years, and then you suddenly discover that this man is innocent. Go to him and say, now you are free. The man's been unjustly jailed for 35 or 40 years, and you just put him out of jail saying, now you are free. Don't give him any bus fare to get to town, no money to buy any clothes, no money to get something to eat. This is what happens to the black man in this country. I can't limit my concern to the middle class. I can't limit my concern to this particular situation where a Negro comes and says, I'm the first this. I'm just tired of the first Negro. I want some seconds and some thirds and some fourths. The civil rights movement has to address itself to this, and the nation has to do it. You see, we are such a rich nation and affluent nation. We often don't see the poor. There are some, you see, most white people can't see the poor because they live in the suburbs. And then they get in town in these big cities on expressways. They don't know nothing about Watts. They've never been there. They don't know anything about Huff in Cleveland, or the west side, or the south side of Chicago, or Harlem. They've never seen it. And they allow the poor to become invisible. And a lot of Negroes, you know, who have somehow sailed or floated out of the backwaters or the muddy waters, and they've kind of been able to ease out into the fresh flowing waters of the mainstream, have forgotten the stench of the backwater. And I can hear a voice saying that wasn't enough. I was hungry and you fed me not. I was naked and you clothed me not. I needed shelter and you didn't give it to me. I needed a drink of water. And in a while, that's 3/4 water, you made me pay a water bill.
And those were just a few excerpts from the extraordinary Martin Luther King Jr. And that concludes our show for the evening, family. You know, it's leaders like him, Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Frederick Douglass, Marcus Garvey, that inspire me in this work to use my gift of voice, my love and passion for reading, my presence, to create these series that God is inspiring through me. And it's a huge undertaking. So I thank you guys so much for tuning in, for supporting my voice, for commending my voice on behalf of the ADOCS and the Reparationist movement at large. I really am humbled by your gifts and your support. I really appreciate you guys more than I have the words to convey. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you tomorrow for another episode of Ida B. Wells 2.0 series, Anti-Black Racism with the Chauvin trial updates, day 7. I'm not sure if I'm going to do another Dear Immigrants show tomorrow. We'll see what Spirit has to say about it. But thank you so much for tuning in. And with that said, family, I want to put a covering over us before we part company, that the light of God surrounds us, the love of God enfolds us, the power of God protects us, and the presence of God watches over us. Wherever ADOCS and its allies are, God truly is, because, family, you are the face of God, the voice of God, the body temple of the Spirit of the living God. And with that said, family, if no one's told you that they love you today, know this, that I love you black. I love you strong. Peace, family. Good night.